Okay, and some of this will go back in time because we're talking about different sections of the Johnson presidency, but the first subtopic is background on the country of Vietnam. We'll tell you a little bit about Vietnam and how we ever got ourselves involved or interested in this particular country. Now, does anybody know who controlled Vietnam in the 1940s and early 1950s? They were controlled by another country. It wasn't the United States. Anybody want, you might surprise you. Anybody want to guess? What do you think, Ashton? So you might think the Soviet Union's a good guess. You'd think it might be a communist country, right? Actually, it was France. France controlled Vietnam in the 1940s and early 1950s. So during that period of time, Vietnam was under French control. Well, during most of this time in the 1940s and early 1950s, France had been in a lengthy war with the northern part of Vietnam. Okay, they were in a war with the northern part of Vietnam, and they fought for 8 years to try to get the northern part of Vietnam to succumb to French rule, and had such a difficult time, they finally just gave up and withdrew entirely from the country of Vietnam. So in the 1940s and early 1950s, Vietnam was under French control, but after 8 years of fighting with the northern part of Vietnam, to no avail, so to speak, the French grew tired of trying to hold Vietnam and simply withdrew. Well, after France withdrew, an international agreement was signed that really divided the two areas of Vietnam into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So after France left, they had to have some sort of semblance of order, so there was an international agreement that was signed that divided the country of Vietnam into two parts, Northern Vietnam or North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And here are the differences between the two, and we'll start making references to the review or the ID sheet. Okay? North Vietnam would be under communist control. Now, can you imagine that's what France was fighting those 8 years over? Trying to keep the northern part from being communist, and it just wasn't working. So they withdrew. So when they signed this international agreement, North Vietnam became under communist control. Hanoi was the capital city, and Ho Chi Minh was the communist leader. So during this international agreement, after France left Vietnam, the North became a communist country, Hanoi was the capital city, and Ho Chi Minh was the communist leader. Yeah, and that's what we'll talk about in the Vietnam War, yeah. The second part of Vietnam, South Vietnam, was under democratic control. In other words, non-communist control, democratic control. And Saigon would be the capital city of South Vietnam, Saigon, and Ngo Dinh Diem, although it's spelled Diem, it's actually Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem was the leader of the Democratic South. So in the South again, democratic control, Saigon will be the capital city, and Ngo Dinh Diem will be the democratic leader of South Vietnam. So we've split the two countries up after France left in the early 1950s. Now, what's going to happen here? What is North Vietnam going to want to do? Or what was the rumor that was out there internationally after this division was made? Yeah, North Vietnam was going to make a play to try to unite the two countries under communism. And that is not what the South Vietnamese people nor the Prime Minister Diem wanted. So it was widely rumored that North Vietnamese leaders wanted to unite the two countries and rule them under communist control. And South Vietnamese Prime Minister Diem wanted no part of that, and really the South Vietnamese people didn't want any part of that. So who's going to strongly back South Vietnam in this possible conflict? The United States. Okay? So Diem knows that he's going to have American support. Okay? And who's the president that's going to be given that support? No? Before Kennedy, because this is the 50s. Eisenhower. So this whole thing starts under President Eisenhower. So South Vietnamese Prime Minister Diem knows that he will be backed by the United States and President Eisenhower. Eisenhower told Diem, we will ensure that your country will be free from communism. He assured that. So he's the one that kind of puts this ball into motion. Now the reason Eisenhower was so strong, felt so strongly about that, is he was concerned about the danger of the domino effect in Asia, especially Southeast Asia. So he was concerned about the domino effect in Southeast Asia. Now what does that mean? Anybody got a clue? Mauricio, what do you think that means? He's afraid of the domino effect in Southeast Asia. Perfect, very good. Just like a set of dominoes, once they start tumbling, once one country becomes communist, it's just going to domino and all of Southeast Asia is going to become communist. Why would he think that? Well, first of all, what was a country that already fell to communism in that area that's communist in 1955? Big country, China. So China already fell to communism. And Eisenhower did not want to see any others. What other country did we lose quite a few American soldiers defending so it wouldn't become communist? Korea. So the situation in Korea, which happened in the 50s that we didn't cover, same type of thing. North Korea and South Korea fought over, we had the Korean War over the same issue. North Korea wanted to come down and make South Korea communist. Same thing. And we beat communism out of South Korea, okay, in the Korean War. So Eisenhower had plenty of justification for thinking that we need to protect Vietnam because we don't want these countries falling in the domino effect. So it was President Eisenhower who sent the first military aid and military advisors to Vietnam. He sent 800 military advisors. Did he send any troops? No. At this point, he sent military aid and 800 military advisors to South Vietnam. So when President Kennedy takes the oath of office in January of 1961, he inherits to appoint what? The issue in Vietnam. Now that takes us to our next subtopic, is President Kennedy and the issue of Vietnam. What were Kennedy's thoughts on Vietnam? Okay? And this is a big if, and, or but when we think about the assassination of President Kennedy, what he would have done in Vietnam compared to what Lyndon Johnson is going to do in Vietnam. It's kind of a discussion. I'll let you tell me what you think. Well, we'll kind of go back and talk about this. When President Kennedy first met South Vietnamese Prime Minister Diem, he was really impressed with him when he first met him. Where would he have met him, or what position would Kennedy have held when he met him for the first time? Wouldn't be president, what would it be? Senator. So Kennedy had met Diem in the late 1950s when he served as Senator of Massachusetts. So Kennedy had originally been impressed with South Vietnamese Prime Minister Diem, and that was a result of a visit that Kennedy took to Vietnam when he was a senator in the late 1950s. Okay, so he originally was impressed with you. So if I tell you he was originally, that tells you that later he's what? Maybe not going to be so much. Okay? Well, by the time John Kennedy became president, he did not see Diem in such a positive light. And there were some reasons why. So he really thought he was a good guy, so to speak, in the late 1950s when he went to Vietnam, South Vietnam, and met him. But by the time Kennedy was president of the United States, he didn't see him in the same light, because what happened is during the 1950s, especially in the late 1950s, Diem really became a pretty cruel dictator, and he controlled his opposition in South Vietnam with terror and imprisonment. So he became kind of a real hardcore dictator during the late 1950s. And Kennedy picked that up, and by the time he was president, Kennedy wasn't near as impressed with him because he had thought he had turned the tables on freedom in South Vietnam. So although it was a non-communist country, he almost acted like a dictator. He was very cruel, and any of his political opponents, he either dealt with them with terror or imprisoned them. He just was really a tough dude. Well, the people of South Vietnam got so tired of that they actually tried to overthrow him before Kennedy became president. So there were several attempts at, what do they call that? A coup on Diem by who? Who would be the person that would try to overthrow him? Not the people, but the military. So before Kennedy ever became president, at the end of the Eisenhower administration, there had been several unsuccessful attempts of a coup by the South Vietnamese military. They had tried to overthrow Diem several times and failed in every endeavor. Now, Kennedy wasn't even interested in Vietnam early in his administration. He never even got interested in Vietnam until like 1963, just prior to his assassination, because he was dealing with two other little issues. What were those two issues that he was dealing with? Cuban Missile Crisis and events in Berlin. Okay, we could say the Bay of Pigs, which is a good guess, but really his concentration prior to 1963 was the Cuban Missile Crisis and also what was going on in Berlin. We were always paranoid that something was going to happen in Berlin that would send us into a third world war. So Kennedy didn't even have any interest in Vietnam until late in 1963. Well, by that time, by late of 63, was the Cuban Missile Crisis under control? Which meant that the Berlin crisis was under control. Okay? So it was late in 63, prior to his assassination, that he really began to take a little bit of an interest in Vietnam. Okay? He didn't even see Vietnam as important before that. He really didn't think of Vietnam as that important after that, to be honest with you. Now, he didn't think that Vietnam was a place that the United States could accomplish anything good. He just didn't see it as any positive result for the United States. Now, does that mean he's not going to help them? Does that mean he's not going to continue to give them military aid and maybe some military advisors? No, but he's not going to commit troops. Okay, he's made that pretty clear. He doesn't want to be involved in a war in Vietnam, but he didn't believe that the United States shouldn't help. They should give him some assistance, but not to the magnitude it got. Okay? So, during his presidency, Kennedy continued to increase the amount of military aid to Vietnam. He increased the number of military advisors to Vietnam, and he also gave them financial aid. So he committed to the people of South Vietnam, just not infantry-wise. You see what I'm saying? Didn't commit troops. He committed military aid. He committed military advisors to help the South win their war against communism, and he also sent in financial aid, money. Well, finally, how do I know all this? How do I be able to tell you this in history? On Monday, September 2nd, 1963, Monday, September 2nd, 1963, which was just 2 months before he was assassinated, he sat down for an interview with probably the most respected journalist at the time, which would have been Walter Cronkite. And the entire interview talked about his administration and everything else that had gone on. But toward the end of his interview, Cronkite hit him a little bit on Vietnam. That happened on September 2nd, 1963. And I want you to take out that handout that I gave you, and we're going to kind of read through that. And this is the interview, and I want you to think about this. This was the interview that Cronkite had with Kennedy towards the end of that big interview. This is the end. You tell me what you think he means by this. So here's what Cronkite says. So get your sheet out. What color is it? Yellow? This is what Cronkite said. Mr. President, the only hot war we've got running at the moment is, of course, the one in Vietnam. And we have our difficulties there, quite obviously. Kennedy's response: I don't think that unless a greater effort is made by the government to win popular support, that a war can be won out there. In the final analysis, it is their war. They're the ones that have to win it or lose it. We can help them. We can give them equipment. We can send our men out there as advisors. But they have to win it. The people of Vietnam against the communists. We are prepared to continue to assist them. But I don't think that the war can be won unless the people support the effort. And in my opinion, in the last 2 months, the government has gotten out of touch with the people. He's talking about the government of South Vietnam. Mr. Cronkite, do you think this government has time to regain the support of the people? I do. With changes in policy and perhaps with personnel, I think it can. If it doesn't make those changes, I would think that the chances of winning it would not be very good. So he thinks that the South Vietnamese government can get together and convince the people that this is something they can win on their own. Cronkite says, Hasn't every indication from Saigon been that President Diem has no intention of changing his pattern? Kennedy responds, if he does not change it, of course, that is his decision. He has been there 10 years, and as I say, he has carried this burden when he has been counted out on a number of occasions. Our judgment is that he can't be successful on this basis. We hope that he comes to see that, but in the final analysis, it is the people and government itself who have to win or lose the struggle. All we can do is help, and we're making it very clear, but I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That would be a great mistake. I know people don't like Americans to be engaged in this kind of an effort. 47 Americans have been killed in combat with the enemy, but this is a very important struggle, even though it is far away. We took all of this, made this effort to defend Europe. Now Europe is quite secure. We also have to participate, we may not like it, in the defense of Asia. So what is he saying? Those people that have been killed, have they been soldiers killed in battle? They've been military advisors that come in the wrong place at the wrong time. My indication here, and most historians' indication is here, is that Kennedy would have never involved us in a large-scale military effort in Vietnam. That's what he said 2 months before he was assassinated. He thought the people should win it for themselves. And if the Vietnamese people cannot commit themselves to become non-communist, all we can do is supply help. All we can do is supply aid and finances and advice. They have to win it themselves. So most historians will tell you that Kennedy had no intention of getting into Vietnam like we're going to tell you that Johnson did. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is the fall of Prime Minister Diem. The fall of Prime Minister Diem. Now we're still in the early 1960s, so who's president? Kennedy, okay? Now, by the early 1960s, the South Vietnamese people were getting incredibly tired of Diem's dictatorship and his leadership style. And they had tried several times to overthrow, the military tried to overthrow Diem's government, but they were unsuccessful. So, what do they need to do it right? What does the South Vietnamese military need to do the job right, to overthrow Diem? What? Say it. What do they need? Come on, who do they need? They need the most powerful country in the world to help them, which is who? They need America to back a coup against Diem. Is Kennedy willing to do that? He is. But let's see how he got to that point. Okay? So, in August of 1963, an American-backed coup was planned by the South Vietnamese military. An American-backed coup. Now keep in mind, the president had a problem in the Bay of Pigs, did he not? So, it's going to be August 63. So, the South Vietnamese military had an American-backed coup in mind. Okay? Now, the man that really supported this coup and wanted America to back it was Kennedy's ambassador to South Vietnam. Okay? The man that really supported the American support of this coup by the South Vietnamese military against Diem was Kennedy's ambassador to South Vietnam. Might be kind of ironic in your mind. I'm going to see how good you remember. Guess who his South Vietnamese ambassador was? Does this name ring a bell? Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. He's the one that Kennedy defeated in the Senate race and also defeated in the presidential election of 1960 because he ran on the vice presidential side. So is Kennedy balancing his cabinet pretty good? He's got a guy he beat twice in an important position as ambassador to South Vietnam. And Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. really supported this. Really supported this. And that was in August of 63. They're planning this, the South Vietnamese military. American-backed coup, and the coup was fully supported by Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who's Kennedy's ambassador to South Vietnam. Well, in October of 1963, the Kennedy administration sits down and discusses the pros and cons of doing this, of backing the overthrow of a democratic leader. That's a pretty big decision, don't you think? This isn't like you're trying to overthrow Fidel Castro, who you cannot stand. who's a communist dictator, but this guy had gotten so bad, Ziem, that we were considering backing a coup against a democratic country. Does that make sense? Because in essence, he was playing the dictator role even though it was supposed to be democratic, and that bothered people in Kennedy's administration. Now, when the coup was discussed, there was a group that supported it, and there were a group that did not support it. And it's kind of interesting on who's on each side. Okay? So in Kennedy's cabinet, his close administration, they discussed this, and they had mixed support. One group supported an American-backed coup, and one group did not support it. The group that was against it, General Maxwell Taylor. All familiar names here. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. And most importantly, Bobby Kennedy. So the three people in the President's cabinet that were against the coup were General Maxwell Taylor, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and Bobby Kennedy were against this American-backed coup. Other than Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, really supported the coup. Really supported the coup. And Rusk supported the overthrow of Ziem because had we given him enough hints, did Kennedy give him enough hints in the interview with Cronkite? You got to change Ziem or you're not going to be able to get the people on your side on this deal. And Rusk was so sick of telling Ziem, you got to change, that he said, the guy's never going to change, so I'm all for going in with the coup. Okay? That's why Dean Rusk maybe went against other people you wouldn't think he would. So that was the sides at the time. Now, President Kennedy had to really think this over, because what didn't he want again? Another Bay of Pigs. Does this smell like the Bay of Pigs bad? Kind of does, okay?